Good morning, good afternoon. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have our last event of this calendar year on Putin's war in Ukraine. We have an exceptional panel to discuss this with you. We have Ivana Klimpouch-Zaza, a former deputy prime minister of Ukraine, and also currently a leading opposition politician. We have Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who was once in charge of NATO's army and has been an outspoken and very prescient analyst of what's happening in this war. We have Melinda Herring, the powerhouse deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, for whom this will be her second to last event in that role, and we will miss her when she goes. And we also have, we hope, he's agreed to speak, but there are logistical problems when our panelists are in Ukraine. Andriy Zaharanuk, a former defense minister of Ukraine, who's also been very active as an analyst of what's going on in this war. So Andriy will join us, I'm sure, as soon as he can, but we'll start without him. So, General Hodges, I'll ask you first question. Ukraine has conducted successful counteroffensives in the north and the south and stopped Moscow from taking back Bakhmut in a savage fight that continues. Last week, Defense Minister Reznikov and General Zaluzhny were quoted talking about a new Russian offensive early next year. What do you expect next on the battlefield?
So I do think that the Ukrainians are continuing to inflict enormous losses on Russian forces that are attacking around Bakhmut. Bakhmut has no obvious significant military value, but it looks like the Russians, particularly Prigozhin, has decided to make this his place, his fight, to demonstrate that he's got the most capable forces. And so this has become, I think, a personal, symbolic, or psychological fight. And unfortunately, thousands of people are going to die as a result of it. But it looks to me, the fact that President Zelensky was there today, amazing, that the Ukrainians are going to be able to continue to bleed the Russians that are attacking there. Meanwhile, I do take seriously the assessment by General Zaluzhny and Minister Reznikov that the Russians are hoping to launch another offensive somewhere from the direction of Belarus or elsewhere from the north, either with hopes of trying another attack on Kyiv, or at least to cause Ukraine to have to divert resources and capabilities away from their main effort, which is really, I believe, working towards Melitopol and Crimea. So I'm a little skeptical that the Russians could pull off the logistics required to do the training, equipping, and to create a large, capable force. And I don't yet know how much Belarus is going to tolerate or be willing to go along with this. But it is a real threat, probably sometime in the spring, unless the Ukrainians are able to achieve significant success in the south that would cause the Russians to have to react to them.
Oh, right now, am I correct in saying we don't see forces in Belarus needed for an offensive? And if that's right, when would we see it? In other words, how much lead time would it take for them to assemble?
Well, my guess is that Ukrainians would have a pretty good feel for what's happening in there already. Plus, this is the kind of thing, I think, where the U.S. and UK and others can provide additional intelligence surveillance that would help Ukraine see what's happening inside Belarus. So I think we will know, have a pretty good feel for the level of the buildup, the quality of what they've got, the logistics, and that sort of thing. What would be clever, and I wish I could take credit for this, but it was Luke Coffey's recommendation. He said, wouldn't it be something if NATO were to do snap exercises in Lithuania and Poland that would give Lukashenko an excuse not to get involved or not to get drug into this thing with the Russians, because he could point to NATO doing exercises on his western flank. I'd love the idea. I mean, that would really be require some strategic agility, but that kind of thinking would give Lukashenko an excuse not to have to provide his own troops to support any kind of Russian action.
You know, you're right. That is a brilliant, what I call political, military, tactical suggestion with strategic implications. I see that Andriy has joined us. So,
Yes.
okay, I will offer you the same question I just offered the general. Ukraine has conducted successful counteroffensive in the north and the south and stopped Moscow at Bakhmut. Reznikov and Zaluzhny spoke about a new Russian offensive early next year. How do you see this?
Well, certainly they will try. Certainly, Russians are looking at the involving additional personnel after the training. So, like mobilized personnel, which they are training at the moment, they plan that they will be more combat ready in a couple months from now, and that creates some obvious threats that they may put it into some sort of counteroffensive. Some sort of additional offensive. Also, we need to understand that at the moment the operational objectives are not being fulfilled and not being accomplished. So they are currently. So essentially, when Surovikin convinced Putin to drop Kherson, obviously he needed to offer something in return, and that something most likely has been Donbass. And they cannot achieve Donbass as we see this right now. Things are extremely difficult there. I have some friends there currently as we speak, and I talk to them regularly. And things are just extremely difficult situation there at the moment. But Russians clearly cannot deliver what they promised. And we understand that at the same time, they concentrated all their forces currently, all their capable forces, and whatever they can do on the two specific operational objectives, which are essentially one operational area, Avdiivka and Bakhmut. And of course, so the fact that they cannot implement it, cannot achieve it, it's the problem. So they will be trying to resolve this problem, and most likely they will try to wait until the end of the winter, collect forces, train them, or recover the units and so on, and try again. And that sort of campaign, a new renewed campaign, is what I believe Reznikov and Zaluzhny were talking about. And essentially, of course, that's a threat. So we need to be ready for that. I don't think it's going to be successful, though. I think that we're seeing fundamental issues with Russian armed forces, which they will not be able to fix within a month, 2 or 3 year, even. Probably with the current regime, they will not be able to fix them at all. But it's still a threat because they will be trying extremely hard, sparing no resources, essentially understanding that if they cannot accomplish, they will be changed. The commanders will be changed, and there will be some changes in the leadership and so on. So they will be doing whatever they can to essentially stay on the job and achieve at least something.
Thank you. Okay, Ivana, Russia has responded to its battlefield defeats with this barbaric bombing campaign of Ukrainian infrastructure and of civilians. The idea is, of course, to break the will of the Ukrainian people and to force Kyiv to focus its attention on civilian needs rather than on fighting and winning the war. Is this working out as Putin has hoped?
Well, definitely, we see that while having defeats after defeats in the military field, Putin is trying, and basically Kremlin and Russian Federation are trying to sow some panic, some chaos and humanitarian disaster on the Ukrainian population. And they have succeeded, unfortunately, to destroy about 50% of our electricity capacity, of our electricity grids, and not that much of the generation, but predominantly the possibility to spread the electricity across the country. And that creates additional serious pressure on the people. But do they get the goals that they were hoping for? No, they get totally contrary, opposite reaction of the Ukrainian people. After each massive attack of drones or of their missiles and rockets, there is an increased effort from across the Ukrainian society to donate more to many of the volunteer organizations and the armed forces themselves, the forces of defense of the Ukrainian that are protecting us and that are also trying to liberate additional territories. Also, people getting more and more angry, but not as Russian Federation authorities were expecting, not on the Ukrainian authorities, and are not asking for negotiations with the Russian Federation, but rather are increasing their resolve and resolution to kick Russians out. And I think that there is this increased kind of united effort of the Ukrainian society to push back. Nevertheless, we also understand that there are, limited resources how we can survive this attacks and this potential humanitarian disaster. And therefore, that means that we need much more mobilized reaction from the West. I'm very happy that there is some kind of attempt of create energy Rammstein and try to react in a cohesive and coordinated way to all the requests from the Ukrainian side. And I'm very happy that a lot of generators are already being sent to Ukraine by both governments and international organizations and volunteer organizations and humanitarian ones. However, that does not solve a problem. And we have to understand that in order to go through this very difficult and terrible winter for us, we need as quickly as possible, already yesterday, we need serious repair capacity to repair our electricity grids. And that means we need transformers, even used ones, we need circuit breakers, we need wires. And that's exactly where all the efforts have to be focused. On the top of that, while repairing the things, definitely we need more and more air defense and anti-rocket defense in order to be able to protect both civilians and civilian infrastructure, but also we need additional weaponry in order to of different types. And here I think General Zaluzhny was pretty open and pretty clear what exactly he needs for the armed forces in order for them to be able to conduct additional efficient counteroffensives in order to liberate Ukrainian territory. So all of that definitely is kind of a common effort, because this is the war that encompasses the whole society and the war of terror that is fought against all Ukrainian nation, and the war of genocide that is fought against all Ukrainian nation.
Thank you. Melinda, Putin's other hope is to outlast the West, figuring that reduced Western support for Ukraine would make Ukraine beatable. Is there any chance of that happening? And is his attack on Ukraine's infrastructure and civilians helping him reduce Western support?
Hi, John. It's great to be with you all. Andre, I'm so glad you're able to connect, and sorry that you were having trouble with the power. The good news is no, John. Just to cut to the chase, I'm going to be very brief because I think it's better to have our Ukrainians speak more than people in Washington. The support for Ukraine is very rock solid, especially on Capitol Hill. The thing that I'm really concerned about in the new year is the budget support. I know people are very worried about the Republicans going a little soft. I don't think that's going to happen. The Republicans are rock solid on weapons and will continue to be rock solid on weapons. I don't think the Biden administration has done a good job, though, explaining what budget support is. Budget support is the Anders is going to correct me, $9.5 billion that the U.S. has given to keep the Ukrainian state afloat. And it's the money that pays for schools, for pensions, for hospitals, And it is absolutely essential. And I think that we'll see increased pressure on Washington to give less on that account. So that's an area that I'm watching very, very carefully. But in general terms, support for Ukraine is solid. And I think it's even stronger as Vladimir Putin pursues the cowardly strategy of trying to destroy the infrastructure grid. Thanks. Over.
Okay, thank you. Andrei, the U.S. has just agreed to provide Patriot air defense systems. What should the West do to blunt the attack on infrastructure beyond this, and by and large, beyond that, to help Ukraine win the war sooner?
Of course, Patriots are extremely. I mean, if that's true, and if we're going to see them in a sort of foreseeable future, that's of course a massive historical event. So we need to understand that if that happens, and in a sort of a time frame which we're discussing, it's just something which was even unimaginable some time ago. We remember when we had the discussions with DoD about Patriots before, it wasn't like even didn't make sense to even start those discussions. So that's a good news. Of course, we are understanding that Patriots is a long range, and we have all different other types of air defense, which Ukraine still doesn't have. And so I suggest that we look at a comprehensive capability of building what we call here echelon system, basically of different multi-level system. And in this case, we can address, for example, obviously we have still a problem with Iranian drones, and for Iran drones, in some cases we've been shooting like 100% of them, but in our latest case, for example, there are several which were missed, and they created a very, very substantial damage. And the equipment which is needed to resist those drones is not that expensive, and it's not that difficult. For example, a weapon called CRAM, which is very widely known everywhere, installed on every major US ship, for example, as far as I understand. I mean, I've seen it myself in a lot of different circumstances. It's automatic and it's not very expensive, and it's been deployed to places like Afghanistan in great numbers. And we've been talking about that for a while, and it's still not there. So to understand, I mean, I understand why some super high ticket items, for example, are difficult, because perhaps they cost a lot, and the commissioning them for manufacturers cost a lot, and it takes time, and so on. I understand why offensive equipment may be an issue, because there are long considerations about the escalation and some implications and so on. But defensive equipment like air defense, especially, which is not that expensive, or those which are not that expensive, and which we know, or everybody knows that they are in great numbers in excess articles or in warehouses and so on. Why that takes so long, we struggle explaining this to our colleagues here. I mean, we just cannot find a proper explanation, to be honest. And so to be more sort of transparent on that, to be more kind of understandable, what is our strategy on helping Ukraine air defense, that would help. That would help, at least, so we're all on the same page, how that policy is built, and how decisions are made on some items, because to be honest, I mean, we're still struggling with some explanations right now.
Okay, thank you. But you, the other part of the question, what should we be doing to help you win the war faster?
Obviously, it's about the capabilities, right? So it's a still struggle of the capabilities. We still have a shortage of ammunition. We still have shortage of weapons. So it's the types of weapons, apart from air defense, it's the same list as we had in May. It's a still same roughly approach. It's still long-range firepower. It's still tanks. It's still tactical aviation, if it's possible. It's still a long-range something like which shoots more than 75 kilometers. Because obviously Russians are right now hiding lots of their stuff behind the 100-kilometer sort of range. And if we have a critical mass of that equipment, of course we can do counteroffensive operations much quicker and much more effective, and perhaps not even in one direction but in multiple directions. Russians are extremely bad in a multi-directional approach, as we all know, because they're struggling with, they still have a super centralized decision-making process. So which means that if we do two counteroffensive, they probably will lose both. So we need to use that disadvantage, but we have a problem. We don't have enough weapons and we don't have enough ammunition for that. So that's a common, quite well-known problem, but we're still moving with a very, very slow steps. We're still increasing Ukraine capabilities extremely slowly, painfully slowly, and perhaps like speeding this up and working on the same campaign plans, just so we're on the same page with our partners about like what types of equipment needed, what types of weapons needed in order to which operational objectives we're going to achieve. If we have same campaign plans and perhaps same sort of campaign planning working groups, that would tremendously help.
One more question here, Andrei, before I move on. There are reports in the papers that the Russian stockpiles for their offensive in Donbass are located approximately 100 kilometers behind the front lines. Not at an accidental distance, because the HIMARS you have only go 85 kilometers.
Yep.
What impact on Russian offensive capability would the provision of HIMARS or other long-range fires with at least a range of 150 mean for you, for Ukrainian forces?
Well, first of all, we'll destroy quite a lot of the warehouses and quite a lot of the logistical chain, because obviously they will react very slowly. So we will have a whole period of time before they adapt to that new reality. And during that period of time, they will have substantial losses, and perhaps we will spoil most of their offensive plans for that period of time. Then after a couple of months, they will adapt and they will keep this even further. But it will be too far from the front line, and then it will be very difficult to feed the front with the supplies. So they will have to break it into the smaller parts. They will have to keep a larger warehouse back in a sort of deep in Russia, and then they will be bringing them with the smaller supplies, and it will be extremely difficult, particularly during the winter and the springtime. So we'll have a very serious operational advantage with this, and of course, any larger kind of a stockpiles, any larger gathering of the logistical of the supply chain will address that, and we will have a serious wins, and we will destroy lots of their capabilities, and obviously that will give us a massive advantage during the counteroffensive.
Just to put to dot the I on this, in a sense, you're saying that longer range fires would have a very important defensive impact, saving Ukrainian lives and making it much harder for Moscow to advance into Ukraine.
John, let me remind you, we are in defensive war.
I understand.
Defending our country, so everything which we do is about defense. And
I agree. Okay.
Right. If we're destroying Russian critical infrastructure somewhere, that's a military infrastructure we're after. And that's all because they should reduce their capability, because we all understand that the only thing which stops Russians, the only thing is a physical ability to do something. So we need to deprive them from physical ability to do certain things, and that's the only thing which stops. If they can do something, they will do it. So what we need to make sure is that they cannot, and then that gives us an opportunity for the counteroffensive effort. So yes, answering your question, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. General Hodges, do you agree with Andrei's assessment of the impact of longer range fires on the fight in Donbass?
Yeah, of course I do. We've been talking about the need for ATACMS for months. If they had ATACMS right now, they could be hitting every single Russian artillery or headquarters, transportation node, ammunition storage site inside Crimea already. They could make Crimea untenable for Russian forces. And of course, I think the Ukrainian General Staff has done a terrific job, very methodically going after the logistics networks, the transportation nodes, and command and control, because without those things, then Russian forces cannot do anything. They can't launch whatever. And being able to hit those targets deeper that we talked about also would enable them to make it more difficult for the Russians to keep launching missiles against Ukrainian cities. So that long-range capability, I think, is important. But look, I would also like to say, I'm glad Andre mentioned CRAM. CRAM is basically a Gatling gun that is slave to a radar. And we had them in Afghanistan to protect all of our FOBs against incoming rockets and mortars. I mean, it's that good a weapon that out to a few kilometers to hit incoming rockets and mortars. I mean, that's the quality. So think about what this weapon, which is relatively cheap compared to the other systems, what that could do to protect so many power installations and so on. So that to me should be a no-brainer. I think our biggest problem, and you didn't ask for this, but I'm going to jump on it anyway, is when you ask what would help Ukraine win, would be for the White House to say, we want Ukraine to win. Here we are 10 months in it. They still can't get over the last little hurdle about saying we want Ukraine to win. If they would say that, then all these things we're talking about would not even be a discussion, because they would be getting pushed forward to the extent that we have them. And I think our biggest problem is that too many people in the administration, including at the Pentagon, good people that want to see Ukraine be successful, are not convinced that Ukraine could ever actually compel the Russians to leave Crimea. That they just can't do it. And because I think that the Joint Staff does not believe in their heart of hearts that it's feasible, then they've kind of already settled on that. And so because of that, that's why because they really do believe that there's the possibility of escalation by the Russians, which means use of a nuclear weapon. That's why they stop short. And so until we can change that narrative, and maybe it'll take one of these famous wargaming sessions where the Ukrainians explain to the Joint Staff, this is how we're going to compel the Russians, we're going to force them out of Crimea, which I think is a combination of continuous long-range fires against the two land routes that lead into Crimea. There's only two ways to get into Crimea, Kerch Bridge and the land bridge that runs through Melitopol, which is already under attack, so that the Ukrainians can already hit both of those. Then at some point, Crimea becomes untenable for the Russians. And I think there are people here that are assuming that the only way you can do it is to try and force tanks through all the defenses, like this was 1943, and the Perekop Isthmus, that's the only way to do it. And I just don't believe that's the way. If we can get over that hump, then I think a lot of these other things can be solved. I apologize, but
Well, no, you anticipated a question I was going to ask later. The point you're making is a very sound strategic point, that if Moscow is having great troubles supplying Crimea because the land bridge is cut and the Kerch Bridge is finally taken out, Putin's got an enormous problem, and his general staff has an enormous problem. Okay, one more question for you, and then I'll move on to Ivana. The big news last week, of course, was the Patriots. How will Patriots be maintained? And is there a need for maintenance support in Ukraine for Patriots and other equipment?
So Patriot, what Andre says is correct. This is an enormous upgrade in capability. The problem is it's a drop in the bucket of what's needed in terms of capacity. If we assume that there is one battery that comes with 6 or 8 launchers, that's just enough, if it's properly integrated into all the other systems, to maybe protect one city against cruise missiles and aircraft. So air and missile defense has to be an integrated network of systems, because you've got drones, you've got multiple different types of weapons that are coming in. It's not nice and neat. And so you have to have an integrated network, and Patriot would be part of that network. But still, I mean, when I was in commander of NATO land forces, we had German, Dutch, and American Patriots in Turkey to protect against Scuds that were flying out of Syria. So it took a battery just to protect the city of Adana, for example, a battery to protect Incirlik Air Base. So this is what we're talking about. So, and Ukrainian soldiers will learn how to operate it faster than anybody else on the planet. I would imagine that they would be soldiers that are already air and missile defense experts that come from Ukrainian systems. So they would learn quickly, and it would not be the normal school year, but it would be compressed. But it will still take time. But that's I think the Patriot could be in action there wherever the Ukrainians wanted to deploy it within a couple of months, if not faster. The maintenance thing that you talk about is really important. This is kind of mundane until you don't have it. And right now, the many different types of systems that have been provided to Ukraine, each one comes with a whole different set of maintenance requirements, different parts, obviously. And so that's quite a logistics and maintenance burden for Ukraine, because now they have to be taken back to Poland, back to Germany, back to Lithuania, back to Slovakia to be repaired. And I think it would be very worthwhile to have a commercial solution that brings in mechanics and parts into Ukraine to fix them there, what we would call second and third level maintenance. If you think of you're the driver for your car, that's operator maintenance. Jiffy Lube is second level maintenance, and then back to the dealer is third level maintenance. Okay, we don't have the second and third level maintenance for Western weapons inside Ukraine, and I know that Andre has been leading the charge on trying to get this capability. You know, maybe a solution is for all the different donors to provide the parts and to certify Ukrainian mechanics. But if we don't address that, then we're losing the benefit of so many different donations.
Okay, thank you. Ivana, let's turn to the politics or the diplomacy of Russia's war on Ukraine. Recently, French President Macron called for security guarantees, not for Ukraine, but for Russia. There's also speculation that the Kremlin might call for a ceasefire in place. Do either of these ideas offer a chance at peace?
Thank you very much. But before I address your question, I'm really very much interested to add something to your question that colleagues were trying to answer, how to help Ukraine win the war faster. And I agree here with Ben, because I think that there is an agreement already in the West that the West cannot lose this war and cannot allow Ukraine lose this war. But there is no consensus and there is no agreement and understanding, common ground that the West backing Ukraine, and Ukraine has to win this war, and what exactly that victory means. And I think that this is the major problem. So, and this major problem creates additional hurdles in terms of supplying us with this or that type of weaponry, or that we are one step behind all the efforts that Russian Federation is making against Ukraine, against Ukrainian people, and against Ukrainian armed forces. Even though, you know, we won't get tired of thanking of all the for all the incredible support and weaponry that we are receiving, but still, I think in order, if we all agree on the narrative and policy of winning, then it's a bit of a different type of a behavior from our partners. And that's what we are lacking in this particular moment, because when we are hearing that, and which we very much appreciate, like that our NATO partners, the US or other countries will support Ukraine for as much as it needs until the end, I really worry what that end might be. And I hope that it would be much better to say that we will support Ukraine till its victory over Russian Federation. And I think that that's kind of a basis for all the political decisions, military decisions. And it's good to be on the same wavelengths with the campaign plans. But I think the major plan that we have to be on the same wavelength is about victory. With regard to your question, you know, definitely the statement of President Macron, who was concerned with the security guarantees for the Russian Federation, created, if not irritation, definitely Bori here in Ukraine. And also there were other calls from, for example, Chancellor Scholz about possible needed negotiations in the next in the year 2023 with the Russian Federation, with no grounds for such negotiations, because Russian goals in this war have not changed. Russian intentions have not changed. They have not. They are not ready for any meaningful negotiations that would lead to any sustainable peace. They are looking for even a ceasefire or some type of negotiations, or at least announcing that, only with one goal: to get the possibility to exhale, to regroup, and to attack again. And so when we are hearing this calls, or when we are seeing these articles that I think an article last week in Politico was actually also suggesting that there are more and more voices in the West who are interested in this conflict being frozen. I think that is the only way to get Russia the possibility to get ready for another attack. And even that article of Mr. Kissinger, recent one, that's not an article on how to avoid another world war. That is exactly the article how to preserve the Russian Federation as a serious geopolitical player, and how to help Russian Federation to get time to start the world war later, when it makes some lessons learned from this particular war that it is fighting against Ukraine, and is trying to fight also against the free world, and will get additional resources if we will not also pursue our policy of sanctions with real honesty and sincerity and control. Because right now we see still a lot of loopholes in the sanction policy, and we also see even some attempts to ease some of the sanctions towards different Russian companies for the benefit of this or that business group. Not in particular in the US, but across Europe, that's exactly what we are seeing. So therefore, I find it very worrisome, all the statements, latest statements, and I think they are also very much misleading. We were hoping that there is finally a sobriety in understanding who are we dealing with, and the Western society finally stopped assessing Russian Federation from the point of view of common sense and rationality and some logic and so on. But it seems that this temptation is still there, and that is getting through with the seeds of such statements as President Macron. But I think that they have nothing to do with reality, and I think it's up to all of us and all those who are soberly assessing what kind of enemy the Russian Federation is, to ensure that we are not falling on that under that temptation, and hoping that Russian Federation, without being defeated, without being isolated, without being punished, can be really talked to in some negotiations.
Ivana, you make a very good point that many senior people in the West seem to be concerned about preserving the well-being of the aggressor, which psychologically and politically is very odd. Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Melinda.
Definitely, it sounds so from Kyiv, when we are hunting for a place with some electricity and with some connection in order to get our message across. Definitely, we would like to have more sobriety and understanding of what's really going on.
Well, even from the standpoint of the Western public, who are also suffering to a much lesser degree than Ukrainians, but still somewhat as a result of this war, these statements seem to be fatuous. It's really amazing. Okay, Melinda, Ben and Ivan have already talked about this a little bit, but I'd like your take. What is holding back the U.S. from sending the more advanced weapons, the longer range fires, the tanks, the F-16s, that Ukraine needs to stop this war quickly, or faster than it's going at the current pace?
I think Ben nailed it. I don't think the West believes that Ukraine can retake Crimea without launching some kind of nuclear war. And I think we're afraid of Russia. We're deeply afraid of Russia, and we don't have a lot of information. We, the US government and the West, and people are making a lot of assumptions. But in general, I think the National Security Advisor and the president have convinced themselves that Russia is a lot scarier than it actually is.
You know, it's really quite amazing because we were much tougher on the Soviet Union, which was a more dangerous foe than little Putin's Russia. Okay. We have lots of questions, so we'll turn to audience questions. Let me see. Here's a kind of a technical one, which I think, Andriy, would go to you. How vulnerable is the border with Russia in the region of Sumy Kharkiv? And would Putin's new Mobiks, the conscripts, be able to extend the battle line so much that Ukraine would be unable to adequately defend such a long front?
So here is, of course, every part of the border with Russia is a risk, and actually with Belarus as well, because of course they understand that one of the weaknesses of this war, and generally one of the risks of that war, is an extremely long border with Russia and then with Belarus. And so that's why we need to constantly have a presence and support the presence of our troops on all parts of the border in order to be able to quickly react and then stop the aggression and then move some forces there if things go bad in some specific area. What we certainly do is that we trace all their presence in pretty much all European part of Russia, but actually pretty much in all Russia. But we know where the troops moving. We have a very good intelligence because of our intelligence capabilities, but also because of the support from US and from other partners. We know it till each tank and till each platoon and each sort of small unit. And so if we see that they are gathering in some area and potentially there is a risk, of course, our armed forces already reacting to this. So is there a potential threat? Absolutely, 100% yes. Are we kind of is there a risk that we will miss it completely or totally miss an offensive from the other side, from other part of the border? No, we won't.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Paul Tonto. I think, Ivana, you'd be the logical person to answer this. What do you see as each side's exit strategy?
This sounds to me as what would you see as a face-saving exercise for Russian Federation? First, I want to declare that there is no face to save in the Russian Federation, neither also in the Russian leadership. So I think that for Ukraine, in order to have any exit strategy, is to survive via restoring its territorial integrity. Because if we leave even one single square meter for the Russian Federation, that will be used by the Russian Federation and in violation of the international law that Russia has taken it by force. That means that we are agreeing for the Russian Federation to have a platform on how Russia will attack further, or from where Russia will attack further. With regard to Russian Federation, I think the exit strategy should be just going back to normal state. And that would be the ideal state of the Russian Federation, because otherwise I see the future of Russia as a country that do not necessarily gets to preserve its territorial integrity, because then we can go into the whole right of self-determination for many nations that are living on the territory of the Russian Federation, and that would be much worse exit strategy for Russian Federation. So if Russia wants to preserve itself within the current borders and wants to be a country that has any possibility to conduct normal international relations in the future, the exit strategy is to leave the whole territory of Ukraine, from my perspective. And with regard to Ukraine, the exit strategy is to conduct negotiations with Russian Federation, how much it will pay for all the destruction, and where exactly, in what kind of tribunal all its war criminals, and for their war crimes and their crimes against humanity, their crimes of genocide, and the crime of aggression will be sued.
Melinda, I want to follow up here with you. You and Ivana and Ben have all talked about Washington not being fully in on a Ukrainian victory. So my question for you is this: given Ukraine's exit strategy, which Ivana just properly laid out, can Washington actually contradict in any way, or will they have to go along with Ukraine's exit strategy?
John, do you mind if I flip that to you, since you're the experienced diplomat? I think you're going to have more insightful things to say to that question.
Well, a little bit unorthodox, but we're not exactly orthodox at the Eurasia Center.
Correct.
I don't think it is possible for the administration to push a different exit strategy on Ukraine. I don't think it's politically possible, and I don't think they want to be perceived as doing that. At the same time, as I think the entire panel agrees, the administration, by parceling out weapons the way it does, is trying to have an influence, and that's unfortunate. That's truly unfortunate. It's penny wise thinking, pound foolish thinking, because in fact our interests are for a clear Ukrainian victory.
John, I think it's going to get this issue is going to get really sticky over Crimea, and I think we're going to start to see that in next year, where the U.S. administration has said that victory is the way that Kiev defines it, but I'm not sure that's actually true. When Ivana wants to jump in, but I think it's going to get really tricky because we know Berlin and Paris don't believe that, and I know Washington says that rhetorically, but I'm not sure that they actually believe it.
Ivana, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, I really think that what Russia has done in the newly occupied territories of Odessa, of Kherson region, Zaporizhia region, Donetsk region, and Luhansk regions, when it conducted so-called the sham referendum that it conducted there in September, actually helped a lot in terms of understanding what exactly has happened back in Crimea back in 2014. And I think that those actions of Russian Federation of 2022 should have erased all the question marks with regard to any possible legitimacy of self-determination of Crimean people on any type of referendum that was held at the with the guns being held near the heads of people back in 2014. And I hope that that is much clearer explanation at this particular moment if we are discussing the legitimacy of Ukraine claims to restore its territorial integrity in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, or Kherson region, and totally parallel process and totally similar process in Crimea as well.
Okay. Let's see now. We have a question from Patrick Dalzell. I think we'll give this to you, General. If the focus of Russian assault is in the Donbass, and there's a risk of Ukraine losing out in a meat grinder situation because they have a smaller army, what should the West be doing? So would the following weapon systems make sense? Anti-personnel weapon systems, GBU 43-5, MOABs, to address this imbalance? That's a little bit technical, so for the audience, you may want to explain what these systems are.
Well, what we're talking about, of course, are either cluster munitions or other technologies that expand the explosive effect or the killing effect of different type weapons. And so this goes back to the original question, though. Are we committed to Ukraine winning? If we are, then all the obstacles start to fall away. If we're not, then you can come up with 100 excuses. Well, you know, this one will take too long. This requires too much maintenance. There's legal implications. Those things fall away when we say we're going to do whatever it takes for Ukraine to win. And I think that Crimea is the key here. It is the decisive terrain. As long as Russia controls Crimea, then Ukraine will never, ever be able to rebuild its economy, because then they'll never be able to rebuild Berdansk or Mariupol. They'll not be able to export or import through Sea of Azov. And of course, Russians on Crimea can always hit Odessa or interdict shipping in and out of Odessa. So for its economic recovery, it's impossible that Russia retains Crimea. And then for its, obviously for its security, to have this foothold with long-range weapons, the Navy and Air Force and logistics for Russian forces in Crimea, it'll be the launching pad for the next war that happens. And we know from history that that's exactly what will happen. So that's why if we're not willing to help Ukraine regain sovereignty over Crimea, then we are guaranteeing that we'll have the next phase of this conflict within the next 4 or 5 years. And I have to say also that what does victory look like for Ukraine must include the return of the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, especially children, who have been kidnapped and deported into Russia. To me, candidly, that's more important than reparations. Of course, Russia will have to pay for some of the damage, but the war crime of genocide, which includes the deportation of all of these Ukrainians and scattering them around Russia in a way that would even make Stalin blush, has got to be addressed as part of any what the final outcome looks like.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Harlan Ullman, which I think goes to you, Ivana. The looming question, he says, is the extent to which Putin's savage bombing campaign will impose such cost on the civilian sector to force a negotiation or end the war. The worst of winter is yet to come. Disease so far has not set in. And if Russia were more effective in this campaign, the pain would be even greater. Then he says, I have argued that Ukraine needs a strategic counter as a threat to take Crimea or more of Donbass. That said, and understanding neither Germany nor Japan quit over the strategic bombing campaign prior to Hiroshima, why do you think this Russian campaign will not have its attendant effect on forcing an end to the war? I think you've partly already answered this, but given Harlan's logic, I want you to hear it and respond.
Well, I'm very happy that the US has drawn a very clear red line for Russian Federation with regard to unacceptability to use the nuclear blackmailing. But I still do not understand how this particular terror attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure are any different from the terror attacks or the possibility of using nuclear power bomb. And from my perspective, it also creates a very similar, maybe, if you can use the word evolutionary, but disaster, humanitarian disaster of a very similar type. And I guess that means that we need more and more mobilization on the side of our partners at this particular moment. As I said previously, yes, Ukrainians are feeling huge pressure from what is happening right now with our energy grid. But people are demonstrating also a lot of additional, if you want to say creativity in their resilience, how they are trying to adapt to this situation. Yes, the winter is still to come, the coldest part of winter is still to come, and people are trying to adjust as much as possible. But definitely there are limits to how people can go through this through this challenge and through this pressure. I think the responsibility here is a lot on the ability of our partners to get the assistance and help urgently. I don't know what other word to use. The urgency of the question is really a priority, and also specific things that are needed for Ukraine to survive this winter. And that includes everything that we discuss here, including the weaponry, but also very specific equipment. So I think the will of the people will not be ruined here. Ukrainians have gone through some line of fear and line of acceptance of fear that probably is very difficult to understand when you are watching this war on the TV screens.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Robin Kalusik, which is addressed to General Hodges, but Ben, if you excuse me, I'd like to give this to Anji because the next question I have, I want to ask you. The question is this: do you really think that Ukraine can liberate Crimea? And if so, what weaponry and how does Ukraine do it? So Anji, over to you. And if Ben wants to jump in after you, that's fine. But please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think Ukraine can liberate Crimea, and Ukraine should do this. And this is for a whole number of reasons. One of them is that indeed, if it's, first of all, we cannot let Russia to be rewarded at the end of this war. So we cannot just say that, okay, we need to win, but Russia still can keep part of our territory. That's not going to be a victory. And the historical precedent which we want to build out of this war is not going to be completed. Actually, it will be destroyed if suddenly the global community decides that Russia can keep Crimea. Also, to be honest, Putin created so many crimes and so many wrongdoings. I mean that it's actually unexplainable, and it's very difficult to comprehend. That it's very difficult to see him being actually staying in the power after the defeat. Because we will be after him in the criminal courts, we will be after him in the material courts, and so on. And of course, we will push him out of Ukraine with a military force. And in the case if his regime falls, again, it's tough to explain why suddenly Crimea should stay with Russia. So if Russia turns into a more civilized state, then there is no scenario it should keep Crimea. If Putin is keeping Russia still, is running Russia, there is no way he should keep Crimea, because then Crimea becomes a threat. And it's not just a threat for Ukraine, it's also a threat for the whole region, since they project the power to the rest of the region from Crimea, using it as a massive military base. But also, it's also occupying a whole chunk of the Black Sea. Because of Crimean territorial waters, which are in turn destabilize the whole Black Sea situation. So the fact that Crimea is a difficult military target, and it's because it's full of weapons and so on, it's actually a reason to invade Crimea for Ukraine, to get it back, rather than not to do that. Because if we keep Crimea as a military base hostile to the democratic community, that's a reason to make the operation, rather than stay away from the operation. So question, can physically it be done? Yes, it can. First of all, Russian army is not going to be just kept in Crimea waiting for the rest of the Ukrainian territory liberated by Ukrainian forces. So they will be throwing all these forces to the mainland Ukraine. And by the time we get to Crimea, Russian army will be extremely exhausted. It's already extremely exhausted, and it will be like twice more exhausted when we finally get to the point that Crimean operation is actually makes sense. Secondly, using the long-range firepower, and if it's not ATACMS, it would be some other types of weapons. We will be making sure that Crimea is isolated and Crimean Black Sea Fleet is destroyed. At least its assault part, so it's its main part. And Crimean air bases and the land bases and the roads and which are used for military purposes will be targeted. So basically, Crimea is not going to be that strong by that time. And as we see, there is a clear understanding, even with Crimean people, that this is not a legal Russian territory. So we don't think there will be a massive patriotic movement of Russian people to defend Crimea, because first of all, there's no civil society there. And secondly, they all understand that this is stolen territory. This is not theirs. This is not like they understand that, because we monitor their current situation. They clearly already they're already understanding that perhaps there would be a Crimean operation. They're very nervous about that, but never they say, "Oh, this is a Russian land. We need to stand for the Russian land with everything." They understand that this has been taken illegally and it will be taken back.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Crimea will be returned, and it's absolutely possible. Thank you.
Thank you. We're actually at 11 o'clock, but Ben, you have 1 minute to comment on that, and that last question just has to fall by the side.
Okay, so I predict that Ukraine will liberate Crimea by the end of next summer. The general staff is doing a great job over the next 3 months of setting the conditions of going after the transportation network, command and control. The Black Sea Fleet is a non-factor. They're cowering around Crimea, and Ukraine does not even have a navy. So that's why I think that Crimea looks increasingly like a trap for Russian Federation forces. And I'm even more confident today than I was a month ago that Ukraine will liberate Crimea by the end of next summer. So that's end of August.
Thank you very much to all of our wonderful panelists. Melinda, I regret this is your last time in the Eurasia Center on a security panel on Ukraine, but I'm sure outside of the Eurasia Center will still pull you back in. And thanks everyone for listening in. We'll be following up with more stuff on the war in the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you.